Hey, Mission and Message folks, this is your professor again. I'm outside. This is Tuesday, February 16th, and I'm outside my church. And I want to show you what's very typical in small towns and probably towns you're from. Right across the street from me is the Methodist Church. And that's the Methodist Church. They're literally right across the street. When they were building downtown Jackson, where we are, the city gave a land grant for churches, and they put them right next to each other. So pretty interesting. Anyway, hope you're doing good. I just wanted to comment briefly about the discussion forum from last week, which really was interesting to me for a number of reasons. Number one, first time I kind of got a chance to glance over the Harmony of the Gospels essays. It was pretty interesting on a number of levels. Some of the stuff I thought was helpful. Some of the stuff I thought was kind of very generally broadly stated. So I want a chance just to address one of the common things we found in your discussion forums. Maybe I can help you with. So let me talk about source, form, and redaction criticism. First, I want to talk about form criticism. Form criticism. You all, of course, are familiar with form criticism now and know what that is. But I want to put a point to it that I think may be helpful for you. I think some of you had a hard time seeing the value of even understanding what form criticism is and how it's helpful. Form criticism, of course, evaluates or determines different modes of communication that were common tropes in the ancient world. So this would have been ways of telling stories that were familiar to the ancient world, historians, biographers, or rhetoricians. And so the idea being that in the narratives themselves, in the gospel narratives themselves, it's very obvious when some stories start and end. It's very obvious when a parable starts and ends. And it's very obvious when, let's say, a birth story starts and ends, a temptation narrative starts and ends, or a passion narrative starts and ends. And so the idea being that once you determine where a certain type of story starts and ends, and you notice that all the other similar types of stories have a starting and ending place, and you notice that other types of literature outside the Gospels themselves have very similar type stories, you can compare their production. You can compare their final form to make observations about how the author is placing certain things within the stories for effect. So one quick example, but people didn't study the parables very seriously throughout church history until we started to use form criticism to analyze how we should interpret parables correctly. So, if you read ancient church history, some of the interpretations of these parables are bizarre and far-fetched. And it wasn't until we developed or we began to study parables in their form that we, I think, have interpreted them more faithfully over church history. That's not to say that all church historians and all church exegetes interpreted the parables strangely or out of fashion with what they actually meant. But it does mean that since we began studying them with attention to their form, I think we've been able to produce more faithful readings. So, for example, if you study Luke 16 in the parable of the dishonest manager, it's one of the most troubling and difficult parables in Luke's gospel. You can't get to the meaning, I don't think, of Luke 16 very carefully without understanding how parables can be told. And we wouldn't even be talking about the way parables are told without form criticism. So that's one of the reasons it's helpful. If you have any interest, go read Luke 16 and you tell me what you think it means. But this has to do with birth stories, different songs and poems in the Bible. Form criticism gives us an exegetical help to interpret passages more carefully. So we ought not to despair. Some of you had a hard time seeing the value of form criticism, and maybe because the essay was so short. But I felt it a little bit curious, and I wanted to help you to see the value of these things without dismissing the whole discipline of form criticism and really a generation of scholarship in New Testament studies without thinking carefully through it. Next, I want to talk about source criticism. Now, many of you really didn't like source criticism, which was just an effort, basically a study of understanding why or which gospel was first written, which one was second written, and so on. A lot of you didn't like this one, thought it was irrelevant. But let me explain, I think it'll help you understand why it's important. First of all, let me talk about the order of the Gospels. I was surprised by your essay, and I was also surprised that many of you actually think that Matthew may have been written first. It's really, and I think it was very unfair, actually, of the essayist to suggest that Matthean priority is gaining a lot of ground in recent scholarship. It may have been the topic of some recent monographs and some recent dissertations, but it is certainly not gaining large swaths of ground that your essayist suggested it was. I think it's a very sexy new theory among New Testament scholarship, but I don't think it is having a large sway among even evangelical scholarship. The order of the Gospels, however, is important to understand because it helps us with redaction criticism. And redaction criticism of all three, I think, is probably the most helpful. If you know which author wrote first, if you can make a guess at which author wrote first, then you can probably make some guesses as to why the other gospel writers varied from the original gospel. Mark, we think, was probably written earliest, at least its final form was with the church earliest. Most scholarship suggests that. It's not the most important detail, but if it's true, it may help us understand some things about the early church. It may help us understand some things about Matthew and Luke that we otherwise wouldn't know. No one questions the legitimacy of Matthean prominence. No one doubts that Matthew had a more pervasive impact on the early church than Mark. The question is, which final version of the gospel was in wide circulation among the early church? No one questions that Matthew had a pervasive influence, especially among the Jerusalem church, among the early Jewish church, and among the early church itself. But it could be the case that Mark had a different reading and a different following and was closer to the sources of the gospel compositions, early eyewitness sources and so on, than Matthew or Luke may have been. Okay, now that's not that big of a deal, but it is important, I think, not to just dismiss outright the notion that understanding the order of the Gospels writing is irrelevant. It's really not. For example, well, I could go on. But I think the essayist and I think some of your responses treated source criticism as though it was totally irrelevant. It's really not. It actually could help us with understanding the Bible. And then I suppose the final thing I'll say about source criticism is that if you are just a casual reader of the Bible, you will notice that Matthew and Luke and Mark sound very remarkably similar. Now, they are very different, but they tell many of the same stories. Now, if John's ending in John 21 is true, that all the books in all the world could not contain the works and the sayings of Jesus, then why are Matthew, Mark, and Luke so strikingly similar? If they were working independently from each other, you would suppose that they would comprise massively different details. If all the things that Jesus did couldn't be contained in any one volume, you'd think you'd have a wide degree of variety. But for some reason or the other, the Synoptic Gospels particularly have included accounts that overlap tremendously in their account. I don't think anyone should debate that. I think it's a very obvious reading of the text. The parables are often the same. The actions are often the same of Christ. The miracle stories are often the same of Christ. And the order of the accounts largely is the same of Christ. So we ought not just to dismiss the fact this is important. Now, a casual reader of the Bible might come to the obvious conclusion that maybe these guys were working off the same sources. So the next logical conclusion is, well, if they all were aware of each other, which one do you think looks to be the most rudimentary, elementary, and hits the highlights the most? Well, I think that's Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel tends to hit the highlights of Jesus' ministry the most. There's very little teaching in Mark's Gospel, not near as much as in Matthew or Luke. And the action in Mark's Gospel is much faster in opposition to John or the other synoptics. So I think it's a little bit dismissive to suggest that source criticism is irrelevant or has no bearing on us. It really, really does. The casual reader of the Bible, and I think just having an obvious reading of the Bible, makes that pretty plain. Okay, lastly, with regard to redaction criticism, again, I was surprised some of you either dismissed redaction criticism outright or thought it was irrelevant. It's really not. We actually do redaction criticism all the time. Redaction criticism gave us the freedom to read Gospels independently from the other two. It actually, while it highlighted some of the differences, It actually began to teach us that those differences are on purpose, and that the Gospels themselves have a unique meaning independently from the other two. And it's precisely because they're different in certain ways. I'm now moving inside because it's so windy right now. So let me give you a little pushback on one of the comments that was made frequently, that even your essayist suggested he didn't like the category of creativity with regard to the gospel accounts. Well, it's certainly true that the Gospels are histories, that they are biographies. But it is also very much true that they are theological histories, that it's a theological biography. Matthew is not just telling us, for example, when he quotes from the Old Testament repeatedly regarding Jesus' birth story, he's not just telling us that Jesus fulfilled certain prophecies. If you read the prophecies that Jesus is said to have fulfilled in the Gospel of Matthew, they seem to have actually nothing to do with the coming Messiah in like a one-to-one corollary parallel relationship. They actually look much different. Matthew is trying to teach us something theologically about the birth of Jesus. He's not just trying to record facticity. And we all do this when we tell stories about what happened to us yesterday or what's important in our life. We always choose stories not just to report simple facts, but to tell others something about ourselves, or to tell others something that we find important or meaningful. For example, if I asked you to tell me about yourself, you wouldn't just tell me facts. You would include things that you think are relevant for me to understand about you. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John are not just recording facts for us. They are leaving us a theological interpretation of history. And so it's important, I think, to recognize that while the gospel writers themselves may be biographers, they are creative biographers. Now, I don't think that means that they're inventing things out of thin air. But you cannot convince me that Matthew is just recording facts in Matthew chapters 1 and 2. Matthew is explaining facts in Matthew's chapters 1 and 2, and so on. You can't tell me that Mark's ending, and I believe the original ending is in, I think, verse 8, where the women run away in fear from the tomb. Mark does that on purpose. He's not just recording facts. He's ending the story shy of the physical bodily appearance of Jesus in the upper room with his disciples on purpose. It's to teach us something and to tell us something about Christ. So the gospel writers, while I agree that they are not just simply inventing things, I don't think that's true at all. They are packaging things for us. They're packaging history in such a way so as to teach us something about Jesus and ourselves. And so in that sense, they are creative because they are interpreting Jesus' life for us, not simply recording it. And I think if we fail to recognize that, we will miss the actual point of the Gospels themselves. And I think if we fail to recognize that, we are your faith will be on shaky ground. So I think it's actually a safest place to be to recognize that there is some level of creativity happening in the written accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That explains so much of their differences. It explains why, for example, Luke's temptation narratives fall in different accounts than Matthew's. It explains why Matthew is able to quote from the book of Jeremiah regarding the Messiah, when the Messiah's birth doesn't seem to have anything to do with the book of Jeremiah in that particular place. It explains, a litany of other details. Well, I could go on, but it's already almost 15 minutes. This is the longest post I've done so far. I hope that you appreciate these disciplines that consumed really a generation of scholarship before us. We are the inheritors of that tradition, and we ought not to forget the past skirmishes among critical and evangelical theology, or we're doomed to repeat their mistakes. Well, I hope you're doing good, and we'll talk to you later.